you're being told that recovery is saunas and ice baths or fancy compression leggings or a magnesium supplement. You can't out-eat and outrun a lack of recovery. The body is an extraordinary machine. It will reveal distress in so many clear and obvious ways, and we've started to treat those reveals as pathology and disease. My first thing shouldn't be to smother that signal with excessive caffeine, with excessive glucose, with excessive adrenalizing behaviors. It should be to listen to that signal. The better question is, where's that pain coming from? And that's a much more challenging question because I can't work that out in a 7-minute GP consultation. Recovery on a broader sense is you and I are both an energetic machine that combusts energy but must also recoup it. What I'm really saying is, are we spending enough time recouping energy? I also require the internal ecosystem of my body to believe it's free from threat for deliberate periods of 24-hour times. And the absence of physiological rest is very similar to being ready for fight or flight all the time. In more simple terms, we are constantly with one eye on the world, anticipating what might happen next. The inside of you is ready for what's about to happen, not what is happening. And so the opportunity cost of being slightly ready is never being switched off, because how could I sleep if some part of me is anticipating threat? We are unevolved to deal with this input, death by 1,000 cuts. And it's not one thing, it's 1,000 different things. And that noise is dysregulating our immune system, it's dysregulating our autonomic nervous system, it's dysregulating our sleep. And what I saw in clinical practice was people going to elite level doctors and having the symptom of that medicated. No one's job actually in the time available to them is to work out why. But the first thing we've got to do to recognize this is for people to start to notice whether they feel the way they think they should feel. We need to understand what is your causation of your lack of recovery and where you have control over those things to remove them. The individual needs to start calibrating their energy levels against their inputs and behaviors. In most people, it's a lack of prioritizing solitude, self-care, or connection.
It's my belief that too many societal problems persist because we keep relying on the same ways of thinking. Question the Default exists to challenge the norms that shape our society, dismantling the status quo and exploring better alternatives for how we live and manage our health and well-being. Question the Default is for those who are driven to create a better future. If this mission resonates with you, please consider subscribing, liking, or sharing. Every single small action helps us on our mission. Thank you. Today's guest is Oli Patrick, a renowned physiologist and lifestyle specialist. Oli has spent more than 2 decades at the cutting edge of human performance, studying how movement, sleep, nutrition, and stress shape our energy and our own well-being. He's worked with some of the most famous names, corporate leaders, and supporting the everyday person trying to reclaim their vitality and look after their health, helping them understand the science behind what it really means to feel well. Before founding his own consultancy, Oli spent years developing some of the UK's most advanced personal health assessments, bridging the gap between medical science and everyday life. What makes Oli stand out is his ability to take something pretty complex and turn it into practical insight, helping people understand the energy equation, which is also the name of his own podcast. This conversation covers such incredible insight and depth. I took so much from it, and I really hope you do too. It's a reminder that energy isn't something we either have or don't, it's something that we can train, protect, and rebuild when we understand the science behind it. At the start of a new year, there's always 1,000,001 goals that we always set out to achieve. And I think this episode, at this time of the year, can be so important for so many people setting out their own health goals and finding balance and control when it comes to their energy into 2026. Thank you. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Oli, welcome to the show.
Absolute delight to be with you.
How are you today?
I'm well. It's a bit of a hazy day outside, but I've walked in here and the vibes are high.
Excellent. Well, I'm selfishly looking forward to this. I think just from doing my research, listening to podcasts you've been on and just reading about your work, I've just kind of absorbed it in all for myself. And I think I fall classically into the trap of chasing one kind of health metric here and there, this wearable there. And I know that that's kind of massively in your kind of sweet spot of passion and expertise. So I'm excited to look at your kind of journey getting to this point and all the kind of myths that have come on the way, but also what you're doing now, which is also incredibly exciting too.
Well, I think all of that is worth discussing. And I suppose I'm benefiting from the wild west of well-being in the fact that, there's very few sort of agnostic maybe kind, maybe logical voices in that space. I think there's a lot of good people in the space, but they normally have a bias, and I'm trying to be the sort of unbiased voice of the people in this well-being storm.
Navigating the Wild West of well-being, I like that. If anyone can kind of remember a kind of phrase from that, navigating the Wild West. It is a Wild West, isn't it? It's an awful space sometimes.
It is. I mean, it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and I think people look at that as a good thing. And I would look at that as that reflects the fact that more and more people don't feel the way they think they should feel. I think it is an inordinately difficult time in which to be well, to be high energy, to be free from ailments, to be free from pain, to be free from self-doubt. It is a completely unique operating environment that everyone listening to this is living in, and we didn't get the operating instructions. And so that has led to just an extraordinary commercialization of products, particularly, which are the fastest growing area, that sort of promise salvation. And I see a logic to everything. I mean, most things are born from a logic, but that logic may not apply to the person buying the product. And I think, well-being is doing really well, ironically, from people not being as well as they would like to be. And I don't see the trajectory of health and well-being commercially impacting the perception of health and well-being in a population level. So, is it good enough that well-being makes bank and everyone feels terrible? I'm not convinced.
Well, we're going to get into all of that and all the different dynamics within it. Where does it all start for you? Like, what was your kind of childhood like? Has that kind of inspired where you are today, do you think?
I think I had a very blessed childhood. It was very good in the sense of it was built around sport, which was great. It was built around community. I had an older brother, and it was built around me recovering from him beating me up on a regular basis in a very healthy but potentially borderline unhealthy way. I doubt he's listening, but he if you are, thank you for the grit, thank you for the resilience. I think I had a love of sport and outdoors, and two parents who were very different sides of the coin. I actually had a dad who was working in management consultancy and had a very intense commuter job. And my mum worked as a psychotherapist. So it was a really interesting seeing stress.
Fascinating where you are now.
Really interesting. And that combination led to a really great dynamic at home. And what was fascinating about my dad, probably when I was about 10 or 11, sort of found faith. So my parents sort of went very heavily into Christianity and were, the definition of born again. From being, my mum was sort of, hedonistic BBC worker in the 60s and 70s. My dad was, an exec, and they pivoted their entire life around this sort of enormous moment that happened to them, where suddenly, probably most obviously, my dad's behavior softened from executive to this extraordinarily compassionate and loving man. And he was always great, but there was a huge change, and being around that home dynamic was a really rich place to sort of discover not just the logic of a psychotherapist and a management consultant, but also the inflection of these values that the church brought. And that was definitely shaping for me in those younger years.
It's fascinating. I imagine watching those kind of two dynamics play out kind of naturally, and then what you speak about now is quite interesting. I always think about the kind of the commuter life that I'm in, and how inducive that is probably to the life I want to have, but also kind of the health metrics I always keep front of mind, which I'm sure we're going to get into as well. But is it health sciences? I was trying to think of a phrase to kind of embody, I guess, like the journey that you went on and the kind of the early part of your career. Like, what kind of drew you to that space? Health sciences? Is that fair?
It was actually exercise sciences, and I was sort of fascinated by the world of performance physiology, and studied that at university, and believed that I would end up in the world of sport that I loved so dearly, never good enough to play anything at an elite level, but really understood some of the mechanics of it, and was in and around top sporting cultures. But then stumbled into a health role, and really health was poorly defined to me at that point. And what was interesting to me, Harry, was it was poorly defined to everyone. Right? So I went into a post-university, almost like an internship, to do cardiac physiology and run this stress electrocardiogram. So if you ever see someone going for a medical, they'll have the stickers on their chest, they'll be running on a treadmill, cycling on a bike. That was the test I was delivering, with a view to identifying early signs of a heart attack. There's more to it than that, but that was the principle. And I was involved in this sort of multidisciplinary clinic with nurses and physicians, also physiotherapists, osteopaths. A really extraordinary clinic when I look back at it, considering this was 1999. And in that clinic, we were trying to work out whether someone was healthy or not. And what was fascinating is we were telling people they were healthy, but me at the end of this sort of multi-practitioner chain, I couldn't be sure that was true because the doctor and nurse had said that this person in front of them was healthy. Oli put them on the bike, let's see that their heart can hold up to, cycling up a hill. But the person was so dysfunctional. They were out of the shape they wanted to be in. It's not my determination of what's good or bad shape. They were out of the mood state they wanted to be in. They were lethargic. They had low libido. They had compromised immunity. They were living a sort of shadow of the life that they might have expected, but they'd just been through a raft of bloods and anatomical measures that had defined them as healthy. And my journey into sort of health sciences was saying, what are we really struggling to both measure, but then to also influence? What is the measurement of stress? Because everyone was talking about stress. Why are we measuring 58 markers for cardiovascular disease and nothing for stress? Everyone was complaining about musculoskeletal disorders. My knees sore, my back aches, my shoulder can't throw a ball. But we had nothing objective to look at who was going to break down and who was not going to break down. Everybody wanted to talk about diet. Diet's still the one, right? If my DMs are rife with people who go, what test should I do for nutritional intolerances or which vitamins I need? But we had no data on diet above and beyond whether your weight was okay or not. And realistically, I sort of had a brilliant medical director who came in from a European clinic or European perspective. And we said, well, what could we measure that allows us to get better insights into the problems people are actually bothered about, but then to also hyper-personalized behavior. So if I have measured something about your movement pattern, when the only thing that makes that useful is what we do with it. If I have measured something about your physiological stress, what's only useful is then what I give you to change it. Yeah. So we were aware that there was data accruing in the performance space, and we basically pulled some of that performance type data that was being used in elite sports into a medical environment. And then I wrote a qualification that enabled other people working as we were called sports physiologists at that point. And we then rebranded as health and wellbeing physiologists. And I wrote this qualification that we were sort of assimilated by the Nuffield Hospital Group, where I became head of physiology. And we relaunched a new professional with a new set of tools. And we tried to talk to people about being healthier, not just did you have a late stage disease. And that was sort of a journey between 99 and sort of 2006, 2007.
Wow. And what was some of the so you were seeing the reality that not enough was being questioned, essentially, and there was more to it than the eye and what was being assessed. What were some of those kind of implementations that you brought in under that kind of new? Was it like a training program that people would then upskill? Did you have to be certainly qualified to go on that?
Exactly right. So you need to be qualified in a health science. 2 years experience, and then we put people through what was then classified as a level 7 diploma. So not a million miles away from master's level. And at that point, then you're able to absorb new information. So you could take data, so you could take blood, you could take an ECG, electrocardiogram, you could take heart rate variability, which has become enormously popularized through devices like Aura, Whoop, other. We were able to take biological markers of nutrition, like antioxidant measurements. So the skill set was first and foremost to acquire quality information. But more importantly than that, how do I contextually interpret that? And context is still the missing piece for me everywhere, in the fact that a result doesn't define you. How I use that result to navigate you is what matters. And this is a really tricky piece for people to understand, that if you and I both get a 7 out of 10 on the same result, it doesn't mean we're doing equally well. This extraordinary multifaceted machine, which has got all these different components to it, can't ever be linked back to a single score. But the score might give me the ability to engage you in a different way. And to create a slightly different strategy with a behavior at a dosage or a timing or something else that we wouldn't have got to without that data. So data doesn't hold the key. It doesn't define you. It defines you in the sense of how I use that data to enhance the questions we're asking each other. And that was really what the qualification brought, which was a consistency to those conversations in hospitals and clinics across the country.
Fascinating. And is that still going today?
It is, yeah. So Nuffield Hospitals and Nuffield Health still run large-scale executive screening. They still have the health and wellbeing physiologist recruitment role. They've changed the dynamic. And I left Nuffield in 2009, very, very comfortable. We had 100 plus physiologists delivering 150,000 assessments a year across different sites and places. And I felt we'd built a really strong practitioner base to start to influence better discussions about health and well-being. And Nuffield has gone in a slightly different direction since I left, and I'd have liked to have seen it truthfully grow into that space a little bit more dynamically. But I think that those people are still out there and doing great jobs.
We're going to get to the energy equation in a moment, which I'm sure a lot of people will recognize you from. What did your career look like, I guess, from the 2010 onwards? Is that fair? Maybe to kind of, 10 years after?
I left Nuffield with two of the senior leaders from Nuffield. Okay. And we set up a clinic on London's Harley Street, which is sort of a strange medical district. So if people haven't met Harley Street, it's 2 roads sort of behind Oxford Circus in London, where every single window in every single house is some form of medical or pseudo-medical operation. And the sort of history of Harley Street is fascinating. But I basically, when we were at Nuffield, we were given a project of designing the world's most advanced health assessment for an incoming chairman of a multinational company. So they said, look, no budget. What would you do if you had to look after this guy who's coming in? Because we want to give him this as a part of his entrance package into this organization. And, a few of us at Nuffield sat down and said, well, but what would we do? And by this point, the movement of functional medicine had arisen, which was, I'm not going to just measure you, Harry, to see if you have a disease or not. I'm going to measure your physiology to see how well it's working. For example, if I think of your digestive system, the traditional test would be, has he got an ulcer? Has he got ulcerative colitis? Has he got Crohn's? But a functional medicine test might be to look at your microbiome and say, are those trillions of bacteria at the right volume and the right density, or are they not there at all? So you're not measuring illness or wellness, you're measuring a biological system 0 to 100, for example. And this movement was sort of early adopted by functional medicine doctors and nutritionists. And it sits in the realm of accepted and not accepted, because a result doesn't mean anything in many cases. So it's down to the context and interpretation of the practitioner. But we had the rise of DNA data. We had the rise of functional medicine. We had the sort of slight democratization of things like imaging, MRI, CT. So we set up a clinic on Harley Street to deliver a version of what we did for this incoming chairman of this multinational, and basically launched the world's most advanced health assessment. And myself and the medical director, CEO, basically looked after a book of global ultra high net worths and celebrities. And I did that for 12 years, where we sort of, that started at somewhere shy of £10,000 per person. And by the time I left was drifting towards £50,000 per person, which morally is questionable, right? And I think is a really interesting conundrum for me, because it was elite level care. And when you do anything for ultra high net worth individuals, there's a chance that you're taking a watch, which you could buy for £2, and you're covering it in so many diamonds that it becomes £150,000. They're both a watch. This was an interesting product because it was really expensive through the time, labor, and the acquisition of every single data point I would need to work out a simple question, which is, am I well? And if you had unlimited resources, wouldn't you want that proven to you rather than assumed for you? And that was the model. So I spent 12 years basically with a group of individuals where we curated every biological test known to mankind. And then we looked after that individual for a 12-month period. And I was their health manager. And what that meant was I then took that person to the cardiologist room. I was in the room with the oncologist when we got the cancer diagnosis. I was in with the psychiatrist working out whether it's a medicated approach or a talking therapy. And we were sitting on the same side as the table as literally an extension of our clients navigating this global healthcare system. And that gave me 2 critical learnings. The first one was, what a fractured healthcare system we have, which is these silos of the hormone person isn't talking to the gut person, isn't talking to the brain person, isn't talking to you. And the second thing is, no single piece of data is going to reveal all, but data helps. And so when someone says, "Oh, I've got this test," I've run every one of those tests, and I've seen elite level interpretation. And again, what I think would be the most interesting part of the world's most advanced health assessment would be the conversation you have before it starts. Which is where you tell me everything you're really worried about. You tell me all the stories of where these symptoms arose. You tell me about the origin and timeline of when things started to go wrong. And maybe we can save ourselves 50 grand of testing because we already probably know where the solution's going to lie. And so I left in 2000 and sort of in COVID 2020, 2021 to go and take the things that I'd learned and democratize them to a price point that wasn't going to be unachievable for most.
That's a really interesting point around the importance of the questioning time and absorbing what the person says.
Yes.
And I kind of worry in the kind of world that we have now that people just don't have the time, A, to give to others, but also B, the forums, I guess, wider than one-to-one, to actually share some of these kind of intricate details about yourselves that are worrying you about your health. And I think I guess is my assumption here, is that we then turn to online spaces, and then that's where we're naturally targeted by the one-hit wonders of the world. And I'm really intrigued to see kind of what you think we can do for some of the kind of everyday challenges that we all will associate ourselves with when we talk about sleep and diet and trying to make sense of it all, but into a forum that perhaps is embedded from an early stage in our education systems too?
Well, it's such a great question. I think you're right entirely. When I think back to that first hour and a half, and there was a doctor and there was I, and we would both sit with this individual and truly listen to them. And lots of people would leave that without any bloods being taken, without any, detailed analytics, without any real advice being given, and say that they were so enthused by this process. They felt that this has been so cathartic. And you go, well, where is that place where you can go without judgment and talk about everything from your sexual health to the dark thoughts you have, to the quality of your marriage, to the disappointment of your career. And what was fascinating about that first dive, which is both a challenge and a benefit, is there was no strategy that came out of it. There's no action plan. The process was to deload. It was you offload to me everything. But the curation of the questioning, and actually the majority of this was done by the physician and medical director. And she would really ask the question after the question, which is, why? And no one would ever really go to that question. And it's not about, I'm going to give you a solution, but just that truly agnostic. This person doesn't want to sell you 5 things. You've already bought the program.
Yeah.
This person just wants to understand the why of you and the why of those behaviors. And on that level, I would say so much of the value was 2 people taking the time to care, to listen, and to give you space to share. And then the blood results that came out, what was so interesting is how often all the results mimicked what you found in that session. And there's simple stuff to that. If you do not move, what do you expect me to find in your bike test? What do you expect me to find in your DEXA scan for your bone density? What do you expect me to find in your brain scan for the electrical patterns associated with increased, cardiorespiratory fitness? If you do not nourish, what do you expect to find in your gut test? What do you expect me to find in your cholesterols and your glucose markers? So there's also a really interesting piece that people think there's this weird gap between behavior and physiology. And that gap is that those 2 things are hand in glove. So what we ended up doing was having this extraordinary cathartic dive into everything in a place that didn't want to sell you a therapy, didn't want to sell you a drug, didn't want to sell you a membership. You're already, it was just a safe space to offload. But then also all the things that we measured in that or discussed in that session would be what we presented on a whiteboard 4 weeks later, having run £10,000 worth of diagnostic tests. But they needed to see it come to life.
Yeah.
So this is your lack of growth and social connection playing out through neurotransmitter analysis. And this is your lack of fiber playing out into a dodgy gut microbiome, for example. So it's sort of the results were just a manifestation of what the person had really described to you in some emotional detail a month earlier. What can we transpose of that back into society is, where's that version of that?
Totally.
Where's that version of that? Because this is sort of a threshold that a friend isn't going to be comfortable to do, because you'll know as well as I, the friend's going to try and solve the problem. It's really difficult because you hear this person making these mistakes or doing these things, and your gut instinct is to pull on your lived experience and try and solve the problem.
Yeah, I know someone who did that, and then it's relatable that the stomach cramp is the same reason there as it is someone 100%. Else 10 years ago that they knew for somebody else.
Because you want it to go away.
But they're trying to help.
They want it to go away. They want you to be better. And not realizing the process itself is what matters, not the proposed solution to the process. And I think then you go, well, then if it isn't that person, who is that individual who just sits and listens without judgment, but really absorbs that information with a view to let me ruminate on it and give some thoughts on it a bit later. And whether that is a counselor, a therapist, a safe space, a teacher, I don't know, but I know that was where the value lay. And that was also where we built such a level of psychological safety and emotional connection that we built these relatively lifelong relationships with our clients. That was a beautiful 2-way relationship.
Which says so much, doesn't it? And I think even It's a kind of like divergent connection to this point, but in a lot of suicide prevention work, we talk about this pathway for assisting life.
Yep.
And as part of the pathway for assisting life, you have to, in a conversation with somebody, be stuck in the middle ground, which is the difficult pain of being heard and not trying to solve the person's problems here and there. And that point is so interesting in suicide prevention that a lot of people miss because they want to drag the person to a place of think about your kids, think about your future. But actually that idea of just being heard can actually be the first kind of light bulb moment where the person may feel like they have something to live for, again, just by being heard. And I think there is a connection. And I'm finding actually at each episode, doesn't matter who we're speaking to, there is a connection to the need of being heard in a world that is very busy. And I think if we can find forums to do just that, I think back to some of my own personal experiences when I would go in with what was essentially a manifestation of poor, lifestyle choices and a bit of trauma added in.
Yep.
Yet I would get assessed for the most quickest thing. And now I see that. And I also see that it wasn't a fault of particular medical professionals, but it was a symptom of society at that time and the lack of education. But now we know so much. It's an interesting time.
And that's a perfect description. And finding that, in that journey, the solving is a real challenge. And everyone would look at this in sort of functional medicine roots, which again is a slight parallel rather than an exact version. That this is the roots of the tree. The roots are where you determine the health of the leaves on the branches, and the body is an extraordinary machine that it will reveal distress in so many clear and obvious ways, and we've started to treat those reveals as pathology and disease. I always look at, we have the energy equation podcast, but energy for me is really interesting because energy is if a lack of energy is there, that is a symptom of inadequate energy restoration somewhere.
Yeah,
and so my first thing shouldn't be to smother that signal with excessive caffeine, with excessive glucose, with excessive adrenalizing behaviors. It should be to listen to that signal. If my skin is breaking out under certain circumstances, what are those circumstances, rather than putting a topical, steroid cream on my skin, which I would want to do, of course, to manage the symptoms. So I'm always all for traditional medicine's alleviation of symptomology, as in I'm in pain, I would need to take a painkiller. But the better question is, where's that pain coming from? And that's a much more challenging question because I can't work that out in a 7-minute GP consultation.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky. And I need an extraordinarily enlightened GP that I got in to see, and they are going to say in the 7 minutes, I can take away the skin flare, but I can't address where it came from. And so you are then cast asunder, and we have, I think, probably the strongest healthcare system in the world.
Yeah.
But you're cast asunder to work it out for yourself. And guess who you're going to bump into? Someone screaming on social media that's through heavy metal toxicity. And the story looks a bit like yours and the person looks a bit like you. And you're then 3 years in the wrong direction before you come back to, actually, that's coming from a place of me not calling out the thing I always knew to be true, but no one gave me the space to reveal it.
And what's so fascinating in that is this kind of that 3-year period that obviously you made up then could have been somebody going through their university life, could have been entering the world of work, becoming a parent, getting their first job, and they may not get those moments again. No. And that's why it's so important, isn't it? That we can give people the truth and cut through some of the noise, which obviously the energy equation is all about. It feels like, in a kind of a combination of all of this kind of wealth of wisdom and experience and foresight, I guess, that you've seen in the sector. What I'd love to do is kind of unpick some of those different areas that make up the energy equation. And perhaps you could talk through some of perhaps the framework and the thinking behind it first.
Yeah, totally.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the energy equation, for those who haven't listened, is trying to sort of fuse a clinical consultation with a person of interest, and there's different aspects to it. But it's produced by the High Performance Podcast, which is one of the top podcasts in the country, and they took these top performing individuals, and they sat with Damien Hughes, who's this fantastic professor of psychology, and Jake Humphrey, who's a fantastic interviewer, and they basically teased out of these people how it is they got to where they got to and what were the steps that we could all replicate. And that model is just a beautiful model. And they are beautiful men, I have to say that. Yeah, they really are. And then we got to conversation, isn't there more to achieving these things than the mindset, the big moments? There's also habits, as in, is there a collective series of nutritional behaviors that are being applied by people who make it to the top? What about sleep? What about exercise? We're all super interested in what people do. What do these people do? What is their way in which they practically enable themselves to have the energy to achieve that high performance. And where the energy equation was launched was saying, well, let's add some physiological data. So I run a 3-day heart rate variability analysis using a very clever piece of technology from Finland, which I used in the sort of advanced health assessment history that I have. And over 3 days, I'd capture this person and be able to get a quantifiable volume of how often they're stressed. I'm going to simplify this beyond the point where it's actually accurate, but how often they're stressed, how often they're relaxed physiologically, how dynamic they are and what's the quality of their movement and that contribution to longevity defining fitness, and what is their sleep and sleep recovery look like. And having run that, I'd sit with a celebrity, it could be someone in the sporting world. We had Ben Earl, the England flanker on the podcast, and we say, how does that data reflect to the behaviors that you adhere to that prop you up and enable you to be this elite level performing individual? And really that's a chance to go, how is this individual applying science and logic and lived experience to a set of behaviors that might be reproducible for the listener? Because on the other side, we've got someone like Stacey Solomon, who's, mum of 5 kids, isn't an elite level athlete, but still has to be a broadcaster, still has to be, a television celebrity, still has to have an extraordinary role in her family. So we're trying to work out, not that there's one model that fits all, but using data, how are these people in the public eye leveraging lifestyle to produce the output that we're all fixated on? Mm-hmm. And so it's really lovely conversations with extraordinary people. And this last series, we've added medical experts. So instead of measuring them, so I'm sitting with top, longevity experts, psychotherapists, sleep therapists. We've had such a range of different professions. We've had biophilic designers who look at whether this room would be enabling or disabling my ability to connect and downregulate stress. And so we're taking the lived experience of celebrities. We've added a DNA test to look at what they were destined to be good at, destined to not be good at. And then we've matched that against what they are doing and where those two things fit. And then we've got the medical experts sort of challenging me to say, how do we all reframe the way we look at energy from these different lenses? So that's what it is. And it's a lovely thing to do.
So it's not really a podcast at all, really. This is
I
don't do it a disservice, really, by saying it.
Well, we tried to do something different because I'm not a broadcaster. I had 25 years of being a clinician in terms of, and so I love to sit with you and work out what it is you need. And I think other people like to hear from that. So we want really curated lived experience, and that's what I'm trying to do, and try at the same time to recognize it is, of course, a commercial product. So it does have to be short and punchy and interesting. I can't have 9 hours of me going on about every micronutrient under the sun, but it's trying to find that place where those who are a bit lost by the well-being narrative can come back to a bit of a North Star and say, look, there's nothing here that isn't going to be in my best interest. And that's the only other thing I commit. Of course, there are commercial sponsors, but none of the sponsors are products that I haven't used or been involved in my pre-broadcasting career. So there's a sense of, can I be a trusted voice? And I bear that burden with some, with consciousness. But I want to be a person that you can trust to go, there is no universal right or wrong in this space. There's just opinions and perspectives you can trust, and partly mine, but also partly the guest in front of me.
This episode is brought to you in support of Calm, the campaign against living miserably. Calm is a leading UK suicide prevention charity on a mission to help people end their misery, not their lives. We both do things differently. We both know we need to change the conversation around suicide, and that's why together we're both creating space to question the defaults that shape the way we think, feel, and talk about suicide and mental health. We're opening up conversations that remind people, whatever you are facing, you're not alone. Calm has loads of tools and resources available to anyone online to help you find the support that you need, including a life-saving helpline for people open every day from 5 p.m. to midnight, as well as vital online resources for anyone who needs them. So if you or someone you know needs to talk, please visit thecalmzone.net. Thank you for being part of this. And of course, today we may touch on conversations about suicide in this episode. Together, we can question the defaults that keep people silent, smash the stigma around suicide, and help build a world where no one has to face this alone. Thank you. I would love to ask you this question. You say quite often around most people are inadequately recovered.
Yes.
I find it such an interesting kind of phrase, and I found myself going quite deep into what that means for me, not from a data-led perspective, I guess, but just like a realization of how I live my life and how I feel in the moments where perhaps I should feel rested and recovered, and actually am I rested and recovered?
Yes.
Can you kind of dig a bit deeper on what that phrase means to you and the energy equation model?
Yeah, I think recovery is probably one of the fast growing areas of well-being, and you're being told that recovery is saunas and ice baths or fancy compression leggings or a magnesium supplement. We've just got to take a step back and go, look, there's two different types of recovery. There's probably the athlete-specific recovery, which is I went for a run yesterday. Can I decrease how sore my legs are today that I could go for another run or a bike ride today? So there's that post-exertion recovery or return to play. So if I'm an elite level footballer, of course, I need to be quickly over the turmoil of a game, both emotional, physical. I need to get over it and get back to being able to deliver another elite performance within a smaller window as possible. That's where most of the recovery technologies are coming from. Okay. Recovery on a broader sense is you and I are both an energetic machine that combusts energy but must also recoup it. Right? And we are a living battery, right? In the sense that if we have a general life expectancy, average male life expectancy, you and I will spend 26 years of our life asleep. And that's quite punchy. Yeah, that's quite an interesting volume of time when we think about it, considering I need to recharge this machine daily, of which sleep is my primary modality, but not my only. And when I'm talking about recovery, I'm talking about the biological return of energy, which is really the mechanisms through which the human machine restores energy, rebounds, gets ready to go again, of which low energy would be an obvious barometer. What a clever machine. When it hasn't had enough energy restoration, it will give you the symptom of fatigue. And that symptom will be there until you don't listen to it. And then that lack of energy will transpose to your immune system and you'll get ill. It'll find you, that lack of energy restoration. So when I'm talking about recovery, what I'm really saying is, are we spending enough time recouping energy? And that's two things physiologically, predominantly. First is my quality of sleep sufficient? And we can do, 5 hours on sleep, but am I getting 7 to 9 hours? And in those 7 hours, am I going through all the biological processes that need to take place during sleep? That's point number one. The slightly more confused point is that I don't just restore energy during sleep. I also require the internal ecosystem of my body to believe it's free from threat for deliberate periods of 24-hour times. Right. So there's a phrase coined by the Lancet. I don't know whether the Lancet originated it, but it published a journal a few years ago referring to an anxiogenic environment for adolescents. And anxiogenic means anxiety generating. So years ago, the World Health Organization called our environment obesogenic, which meant everything was trying to mean I moved less and ate ultra-processed, high-calorie food. So I'm more likely to gain weight in this modern environment. That's totally true. Now we have an anxiogenic environment, which has basically gone to war with my internal ability to believe there's nothing I need to worry about. And what we're looking at with an anxiogenic environment is the antithesis, the enemy of true rest and recovery, which is today, you and I will pick up a supercomputer that will tell us about every horrible thing that's ever happened in the world. It will live stream all the people we've ever met, the best moments of their life, directly into our face. While that's happening, there'll be an abundance of excessive light, an abundance of excessive noise. Not in here, it's beautiful, but principally we will be encountering stimulus everywhere. Plus, I've got, every relative ever alive is contactable, but also not contactable at the same time. Everything, and we call this overarching abundance of physical, psychological, emotional inputs, allostatic load. And it's like all the things Oli Patrick, Harry have to deal with today is going in. And how many of those things slightly mean that the internal physiology is alert and ready? And we look at this called something called autonomic nervous system regulation. And when I first got into the health assessments, we started measuring this through a technology called heart rate variability. So heart rate variability, popular, you've probably heard of it before. Itself doesn't mean much. What you're using heart rate variability for is to work out how often an individual is prepared for threat and how often they're prepared for rest and recovery, and to what degree they're ready for threat and what degree they're resting and recovering. And when I first started measuring individuals in fairly, significant roles and big existences, we found, and this is again layman's terms, we didn't find them excessively stressed. They weren't running from a saber-toothed tiger in this fight or flight analogy that gets thrown around, which is it's inaccurate and misleading. What we found is they're not ready for fight or flight all the time. They are never ready for rest and recovery. And the absence of physiological rest is very similar to being ready for fight or flight all the time.
Yeah.
And in more simple terms, we are constantly with one eye on the world, anticipating what might happen next. And that might happen next is deeply relevant, because your internal physiology is always making sure that the inside of you is ready for what's about to happen, not what is happening. So if I believe in a minute you're going to throw something awful at me, you might well do, physically, emotionally. If I believe something, if I've got trepidation or anticipation, my heart rate will rise slightly, my blood pressure rises slightly, my temperature rises slightly as I anticipate some form of combative situation. Now, that means all those physiological processes are instead of quality digestion, quality immune regulation. And so the opportunity cost of being slightly ready is never being switched off. And this plays deeply aligned with a rise of digestive issues, because that opposite nervous system is rest and digest. This plays deeply relevantly into 61% of the country that can't sleep, because how could I sleep if I believe some part of me is anticipating threat? And what we've got is this abundance of inputs, this relentless onslaught is totally new to our physiology. In the last 15 years, we are unevolved to deal with this input, death by 1,000 cuts. And it's not one thing, it's 1,000 different things. And that noise is dysregulating our immune system, it's dysregulating our autonomic nervous system, it's dysregulating our sleep. And what I saw in clinical practice was people going to elite level doctors and having the symptom of that medicated.
Yeah.
Over time. And then we see people taking action that deliberately recalibrates that nervous system, like going analog, time in nature, like reconnecting in-person connection, like meditating, like breathing. And these modalities that have suddenly then become the new commercial vehicle of the wellbeing sector all have a similar thread, that they are bringing true recovery, not the elite sport level, but the you and I needed level. Not that we're not elite sportsmen. We could have been.
Still think I can make it.
You could still make it. I'm gone. You could make it. But principally, when I'm talking about we're inadequately recovered, Harry, it's two things. We are bombarded by stuff that says don't ever recover. And we've lost touch with those feedback loops that were saying it isn't good enough, because we're medicating them and we're suppressing them through drugs, through alcohol, through caffeine, through behaviors that mean I didn't realize I've been suppressing those signals until sometimes it's too late. That too late could be a burnout, which is an occupationally health defined condition. It could be poor psychological health and well-being. It could be, a collapse of some system of biology, but the body can't do it indefinitely.
I have about 101 questions in my head now.
Great.
And an ADHD brain like mine will kind of probably lost track of the one at the beginning to now ask the one at the end. But I do want to, the point you mentioned around medicating the symptom that you saw happening. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, so if I'm slightly ready for threat, then that preparatory physiology would lead to a slightly higher blood pressure. Yeah. So I go and see a cardiologist who says, your blood pressure's high. Let me give you a medication for that. If I'm slightly ready for threat all the time, that would lead to a slightly higher circulating level of blood glucose, because that's my fuel for dynamic encounters. Yeah. So I'll go and see an endocrinologist who goes, you're drifting towards insulin resistance, here's a medication for that. If I have got an inadequate, if that nervous system is ready for threat all the time, I'll start to develop some symptoms of gastrointestinal distress. Could be acid reflux, would be a potential thing. I'll go and see, again, a gastroenterologist will give me a proton pump inhibitor for that. I might wake up with lethargy. I'm not feeling refreshed and abundant in my first, hour of the day. I might meet on the DSM chart for my GP a clinical diagnosis of depression. I'll be given an SSRI or equivalent. I might go and see an inflammatory doctor because I've got sore knees all the time. But it was a lack of my body's ability to naturally quell inflammation. And I'm taking those 5 examples because those are 5 I saw so frequently, where and of course that is not anyone's fault, right? The cardiologist's job is for you not to have a heart attack. The gastroenterologist's job is for you not to be riddled with reflux that causes, ulcers and a whole range of challenges down the line. The sports medicine doctor wants you running again. No one's job, actually, in the time available to them, is to work out why. Their job is to say, in the 15 minutes that you've paid for privately, or the 6-7 minutes you got through, again, state-funded healthcare, can I take away the problem you walked in here with? And the problem you walked in here was with pain. You didn't tell me that the pain's coming from a difficult marriage and you worried about all these past traumas that haven't resolved themselves that are manifesting through that blood pressure, etc. And this is what, we come back to what were the great challenges of the healthcare system. If I look at you from a system of biology, as in I just look at your cardiovascular system or I just look at your hormonal system, outside of really clear illness, there's some obvious hormonal dysfunctions, there's some obvious cardiological challenges, but most of the things are just my body revealing this problem through a particular parameter that was my crack in the floorboards, if you like. And then I see that particular specialist who tells me I'm going to take that pain away. And then the crack over here pops up, the crack over here pops up.
And it keeps on coming as that relentless kind of cycle where you kind of, and if I look back over the last 13, 14 years of my life, I think I've been tested for underactive thyroid. I've had numerous tests around sex drive during parts of my life. I've had numerous tests for my stomach. I used to have intense stomach cramps, incredible stomach cramps, bowel-related issues, vast tinnitus in my ears, numerous things. I had kind of a diagnosis here and there. What stopped all of that was changing my lifestyle significantly.
I love it.
Managing my work, managing my relationships, the basics. I have quite a high drive. Like I push myself probably too much, but I crash in seconds. Like I've never had a problem with sleep, and I always think to myself, well, if I get the right amount of sleep and I'm eating a good diet, and I think I am eating a good diet most of the time. I understand around alcohol moderation, don't take drugs, all the kind of things I should do, I do. But I always have these problems. I work too much. I work too much, and I didn't have breaks, and I didn't sort the basics in that 8-hour window, and I normalized the speed and the intensity of my work, and numerous problems occurred. Until when the moment I realized that was happening, and I started to just agree on X amount of movement per hour, X amount of movement in my day, X amount of exercise during a week. For me, I don't have ringing in my ears anymore. I don't get stomach cramps. I don't feel that overwhelm in my chest. I still have a high level of pressure in my work. I have 2 young children, but I was being what I felt medicalized so quickly when I would go to the doctors. Test this, everything's fine. All of those things. I
think that's. I think we should dive into that, because
that's like 10 years of waste.
This is the story, right? And again, that's what's interesting. Remember the phrase, "You can't outrun a bad diet," and it was sort of sense of, look, if I do all the exercise in the world and I don't eat well, it won't offset that, because they're different inputs, and my physiology requires both. Well, you can't out-eat and outrun a lack of recovery, right? So we're finding, and a lot of people who are really dedicated to their sort of personal well-being and have created quite a strong performance or aesthetic as a result of that, are now realizing that they're still creaking and they can't work out why. Now, when we look at, again, I can't do any of this without data, but when we look at, when I have that excessive body ready for threat, my body's perpetually at the expense of being relaxed, of course, digestive is the first thing that is obvious sign, because there's just a lack of blood flow to my digestive system, a lack of secretion. So some form of amorphous digestive discomfort, could be runs for some, could be bloating for others, is a very logical thing. When we look at thyroid, when we don't restore enough energy biologically, the body's got a sort of a reserve tank. And we hear a lot about cortisol. Cortisol is called the stress hormone, so people think it's bad. 2 things there. Stress is really good for you until it's too much. So stress is critical for us until it's too much for too long. And cortisol is critical for us until it's too much for too long. And cortisol is something we should all be producing every day. It helps wake us up. It should be high in the morning and then depreciate during the day. But when people don't get this balance right, cortisol is a bit like your savings account propping up overspending on your current account. And that savings account doesn't come at no cost, because cortisol is made from the same thing that makes testosterone. So we call this DHEA steel. And effectively, why we see depreciation in libido and fertility in periods of chronic stress is the same, if you like, building block that makes the stress hormone also makes your what we call androgen or sex hormones. So if I make more stress, I basically shut down those pathways, which is so logical, right? Because if I was in a war or a famine, it's not the time to make a baby. It's not the time to feel a bit horny. So,
it's true though what you're saying.
Totally true. So we see a depreciation in testosterone. The other thing we see is when we see high cortisol, it then can start to challenge the thyroid. So we see it having a sort of an impact on thyroid function. It affects the thyroid gland, which is this sitting, like a little butterfly sitting at the base of your neck. And we see cortisol at high levels inhibiting thyroid function. So you can draw back and go, look, your ADHD lent you into behaviors that you have to harness. And you can, we know that you can turn that into an extreme superpower. It can be an absolute Achilles heel, depending on how you harness it or let it loose. But it can be associated with relentlessness.
Yeah.
And that relentlessness was throwing you signs digestively, thyroid, virility. And as you rightly say, those become medicalized. Now, again, we've got to be careful. There's people who have all of these issues through nothing to do with stress, nothing to do with hormones. They're just purely either genetic or unlucky.
Totally.
It could be a random inhalation of something one day and physiology turns on a knife edge. But principally, the story you're relaying there, Harry, is a very common story that I saw in practice, where we then go back and say, how do I embed more recovery? Not change your personality, but you fundamentally brought in pockets of restoration. And by enabling that, you decreased your body's flare signaling, and those issues go away.
Totally.
It's a beautiful case study that would relate to almost everyone listening to this on some level, but they might not have realized those flares are 2 steps down the line from them never giving themselves any kind of break, any kind of kindness, 100%. Any kind of self-compassion, which to me sits at the heart of getting this right.
That's amazing. I love how you framed that. And I think that having that, if I had that perspective, a decade ago, life would have been so different. And because my ADHD diagnosis came within the last 2 years.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a light bulb moment on all those things that I described and 1,000,001 others.
Yes.
And at the heart of a lot of the work that I do is around, openness around mental health, suicide prevention, both my thoughts of suicide, but also reflecting on others and helping to prevent suicide at the core of really what I've been trying to do my whole career. But also, I always explain it as, my life got better when I started to be open. I actually think all of this is connected though, because as soon as I started to be open, all of those kind of basic health principles I'd get frustrated by changed. It was almost like as I was able to connect in a social environment how I wanted to, without the mask and without the facade that I was preparing myself going into social environments, my stress reduced naturally, because when I was speaking to people, I just tell the truth. I lost my dad to suicide. This is how I think about suicide. This is why I'm passionate about mental health and I want to have an open conversation with you. And I could be myself. And what came with that is that I didn't have the guard up.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you're describing, really, is this guard. And I think there must be, and again, not trying to put the scientific lens on it from at least my perspective, is that then created environments where I could meet somebody from a relationship, romantic perspective.
Entirely.
Because I didn't have the stress going into that environment. I could be myself. And then a working environment that was right for me. I could think clearly.
Yes.
The cloud had gone. And I worry to somewhat around this kind of environment of, I'm going to get the terminology wrong that you use to compare the kind of obesity kind of moment,
anxiogenic
environment that we're in, about how perhaps society, we don't see that we're in it.
Oh, enormously.
And how do we find spaces for everybody to realize what those anxiety-inducing moments are in our society? How do we get to that point?
I don't know.
That's an easy question for you.
Yeah, lovely. The societal challenge. I don't know, because I think the first thing, which is what you also did, is you have to tune back into you. It's very easy to disconnect. I mean, one of the question I ask everyone on the energy equation is rate your energy over the last 6 weeks out of 100. And that I'm talking about your physical energy. I'm talking about your emotional energy, my ability to harbor maybe difficult relationships. I'm thinking about your mental energy. Am I strategically thinking, or do I feel like I'm firefighting and foggy all the time? And maybe my spiritual energy, which is more easily sort of transposed as purpose. Do I feel like I'm doing something? Do I feel like what I'm doing matters? Not am I, Mother Teresa, running orphanages, but do I see some fruits of my labor? And I always think some of the roles that have the greatest value of that are those in like a carpenter or somebody who makes something. So there's a lot of roles where you don't necessarily see any impact of what you do, and that can be challenging. Those roles are fundamental to society, but then you need to find other things outside of that give you that sense of I'm contributing. It's quite an important piece. So let's take that score out of 100. Lots of people can't come up with that score because they haven't paused and thought, how do I feel? And we can go way the too far the other way here, where someone wakes up every day and goes, how do I feel today? And I need to cut that person out of my life, or I need to change my job. We don't want to be taking an absolutely everyday sort of, biblical score. But the first thing we've got to do to recognize this is for people to start to notice whether they feel the way they think they should feel.
Yeah.
Now, data helps here, right? So why Whoop, for example, has risen to such popularity is it starts to bind the way I feel to maybe the most relevant piece of data that would affect that, which is this recovery score.
Okay.
So where Whoop's got a recovery score, it's actually looking at how abundant my time was in that physiological state of restoration. And what was interesting about Whoop and Aura and others is they basically sold originally to the elite athlete group who were worried about overtraining. Should I do 2 sessions today, or should I do a 6th session? And really, the people I put these devices on are those who are with young kids, got to commute, juggling life. And it's like, what am I putting into my input basket that is tipping me over the edge? Mm-hmm. And if I notice that my subjective appraisal of well-being is not what it should be, and I notice that my physiological recovery is not as it should be, then what are the patterns of behavior I can observe? It was when that person came over that tipped me over the edge. It was coaching my son's football team. It was 5 days commuting in a row versus 4. It was 2 nights drinking in a row. And what we can do here is we could list 1,000 things that induce recovery, but that isn't the solution to the listeners. The listeners is saying, we need to understand what is your causation of your lack of recovery and where you have control over those things to remove them. And in most people, it's an overcommitment. In most people, it's a lack of prioritizing solitude, self-care, or connection. And I put both of those in there because there's some people who are, so connected, they forget that they require solitude. And for others, there's some people where they've got so used to solitude, they forget they need connection. Mm-hmm. But the danger is us going on social media and saying everyone needs to join a chess club, or everyone needs to go for a walk in the woods on their own. I don't know. What I do know is the individual needs to start calibrating their energy levels against their inputs and behaviors. Data can help with that, but they can do those 2 things. And then when you see that energy depreciating, you need to look back over that last 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks and go, what did I dial in or what did I dial out? And that will become your lever. And the big themes there would be, just stillness. How often am I still? How often am I analog? Am I without digital inputs in nature? How often am I, free from stimulants and suppressants, so caffeine and alcohol? How often am I joyful? Am I doing things of pleasure and frivolity? And we so often just lose track of stuff. Years ago, I worked with a management consultancy, and we used to do things called a needs analysis, which would be we'd write down all things that they loved. It wasn't needs analysis, it was called a wants directory, that's what it was. So all your favorite hobbies in the world, all the things that made you feel amazing, and you scaled them all and you wrote this whole page. And the next page was awful. It was like, how often have you done these in the last 4 weeks? And you had this thing where you're like, all the things I love to do, I'm just never doing them. And I'm not saying quit the job and, become a kite surfing, sort of scuba diving instructor, but we have to find this space that my physiology, my unevolved, primal version of me believes that it is free from something that might attack it. And I have to trick that state in the modern world because it won't come naturally.
Wow. So you talked a lot around the kind of this score. It's like readiness type score that we have. And I know different kind of wearables have different ways of using it. January is an important month where we're probably all kind of all turning up to the office with our brand new wearables if we're lucky enough to have been gifted that over the Christmas period. But also, punchy goals. And I think what kind of the Atomic Habits did for me was had a huge impact really around reframing how I think about goals and where I'm going to, but also the embedding nature of that person I want to be in this kind of small act. And the small act can then generate obviously the kind of person you want to become as such. I'm not doing it justice, but if we're making sense now of like the habits going into the year, we're all going to have our views on what we should be tracking and what we should be looking at.
Yes.
So I guess the first question is, should we be tracking a particular metric? If so, what metric? And then B, when it comes to wearables, a very honest question, what is the most effective, most kind of targeted wearable that you would suggest?
Yeah, there's no one that works for everyone. You know, I would, and people always go, "What's your favorite wearable?" That's the most. I get 2 DMs quite frequently. You know, I've not got tons of followers, but I get which wearable should I get, and which nutritional test should I get, and the second one is even harder than the first one. And when I get that first question, I go, "What question are you asking?" And they're like, "Oh, I just wanted to get a wearable." No, but what question are you asking? Whether you're active enough? Are you asking whether your sleep's good enough?
Okay.
Are you asking whether you're too stressed? Are you trying to work out why you're tired? Are you trying to build a new community? But we need to start with the question, not with the product, because the product can help me answer the question, right? From a data point of view, we know that people who wear, again, pedometers, you know, something that tracks your movement, adhere to more steps and have better weight management. So that's pretty good for January. So there's just the visibility of keeping an eye on your steps or step equivalents if you're not able to take steps is in itself useful, motivational, and I'm a big believer in. Until I find people walking around their kitchen trying to get over the 10,000 mark, and I worry about those individuals because then we've maybe lost sight of what we're trying to achieve. But I think that the first thing is what is it I'm not convinced about? What is it I need more empirical proof of? That really matters. From a wearables point of view, you know, I think the biggest area affecting society is misunderstanding that sleep is a process that begins earlier in the day. Right? You mentioned earlier that you might have been getting enough sleep architecture. So there's this sequencing of these potentially 90 to 120 minute cycles where I go into this thing called rapid eye movement or REM sleep. Then I go to slow wave or deep sleep. And how I move between those and wakefulness is really the determinant of whether 10 biological processes that only take place during sleep took place sufficiently. So I see people sleeping 7.5 hours, but it's junk. I see people sleeping 6.5 and it's gold. And I think when we're interested in, for me, if I'm going to spend 26 years of my life doing something, I'd like a piece of data that said, I understand the behaviors that induce better quality sleep, and I understand my personal dosage of the behaviors that inhibit sleep. And there's very few wearables that I say you need to use all year round or forever, but I like to calibrate seasonally my routines against my sleep quality and go, okay, I need to stop my caffeine at 3. Actually, if I have 1 glass of wine at 6, I'm okay. Actually, if I train too hard, too late, I don't sleep well. And I start to build my rules that don't define me. But when I'm particularly tired, I know the day before I'm going to do a big speech, or I've got a big, board meeting, then I'll have my last coffee at 12. I'll go to bed between 10:30 and 11. I will be off my phone 45 minutes before that. I'll have gone for some form of walk between finishing work and going to bed, because I've seen over the data, those are things that induce my best quality sleep cycling, for example. So I think if we look at steps, most people are pretty aware of, right? That, you know if you're moving or not moving, and you know if you're loading or not loading with exercise. So you might want that wearable to build community. So you and I are accountable to each other for both going to the gym. You're my virtual gym partner. So there's all social constructs to that. But movement, put it in a box. Sleep, I think if you don't sleep well, rarely does a sleep tracker improve it.
Yeah.
And I say that because there's a great chance of over-adding data to a process that's really about being devoid of overthinking, devoid of data. And if someone's got a clinical sleep disorder, like difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, or they're waking up frequently, I wouldn't start with a wearable. I'd start with a clinical consultation with a online sleep clinic probably. And I work frequently with Sleepyhead, which is a digital CBT company that's a really good place to start. That says, have you done the fundamentals of what sleep requires before you start wearing monitors and doing all sorts of funky things? So the sleep physiologist there, Steph, runs a digital service that I personally think is an excellent framework for those who are struggling to sleep. So if I haven't got a sleep disorder, I wouldn't mind calibrating sleep. That would be sound. The heart rate variability monitors. So here we're looking at your whoops, your auras, etc. Yeah. These are a simulation of movement quality, sleep quality, and recovery. And I genuinely think they are really revelatory for most people to give you your dosage of effectiveness, right? And I talk a lot about minimum effective dose. So government health guidelines for me are I need to do 150 minutes. Well, for you as well, by the way. We need to do 150 minutes of cardio. I need to do 2 weight training sessions a week. I need to do 2 mobility sessions a week. My government guidelines for my food plate is I need to achieve 5 portions of fruit and veg a day. I need to get the food plate. I get all these government guidelines. None of them apply to me because none of them know me. They don't know my genes, my lifestyle, my demands. So where I've got a wearable, I can start to personalize how much do I need of these things by saying, what is the minimum effective dose of cardio for my cardiorespiratory fitness as determined through a metric called VO2 max, which will be measured by these devices, to be stable. right? What is my volume of sleep for me to be recovered? What is my volume of steps for me to be, achieving the sort of the requirement? And I'm similar to you, I think, Harry. I'm fixated on my children, fixated on quality of life. I'm not that interested in the habits of well-being. People, I say it before, I have a great life coach friend who lives out in LA, and he's a glorious man. He's a stylist. Russell, if you're listening, you're a hero. And he introduced me once at a talk. He said, what I love about Oli is he doesn't look like a well-being professional. And I was like, Russell, you beast, because I'm not, stacked, right. and I'm not going, this is how I am well, so you must be well too. And the principle there is I do the least amount of exercise. I eat the minimum effective diet. I hydrate to the minimum because I'm trying to live. I'm not living for well-being. My job is to be me, and well-being allows me to do that. So we've got to flip the narrative. My purpose shouldn't be well-being. My purpose is my purpose. Well-being allows me to get to my purpose. So when you wear a wearable like a Whoop, you are going to hyper-personalize your minimum effective dose of movement, stress management, if you like, and sleep to say, right, I've built a framework now that goes, that's my relationship with caffeine, alcohol, being outdoors, my wife, my kids, my coaching. That I sort of go, I know what the rules of the game are. And when I feel like I need to dial them up, I can dial them up. When I need to dial them down, I dial them down. And therefore, if you've been bundled a wearable in Jan, I think it will be valuable, but sit down and think, what are the things that you're not sure about from a lifestyle point of view? And then see if it helps you answer those to get your minimum effective dose.
That is fascinating. Again, so VO2 max, can you get deeper?
Yeah, I should never. It's a horribly technical word. And VO2 max is the volume of oxygen that I can achieve at maximum exercise. So that's where the VO2 max comes from. It's popularized a little bit because some wearables are now able to capture it. If you ever, again, look at sort of a traditional medical, you see people cycling with the chest leads on, but they'll also have a mask on their face.
Okay.
The mask on the face is not really to look at breathing, it's to look at how much oxygen you and I as a machine can consume. So we breathe in air, but we consume the oxygen, right? So that's a really important distinction. There's 21% oxygen in the air we're breathing. I'll breathe it in, out comes 17 and a bit. So that 4% of oxygen is because my tissues use it. I smash oxygen together with a fuel, maybe glucose, and that's the energy that you and I are running on now. So the more oxygen I can consume, the more work my body can achieve. And the more work I can achieve, the better performance athlete I will be. So VO2 max was a way of measuring how much oxygen someone would consume in a minute at maximum exercise. And that would say who's a better triathlete, marathon runner, cyclist. Until we realized that same parameter at the other end of the spectrum would also determine who can leave the house without care or who could survive an anesthetic in a hospital. Because this is where we think about physiology as a linear beast. My body's ability to consume oxygen could be amazing, and I can, win a Olympic marathon, or it can be awful, and I can not survive the night, right? And medicine gets interested when it's really low, and sports performance gets interested when it's really high. But where are you and I? And I think when we look at VO2 max, really, in layman's terms, this is the objective measurement of endurance capability or cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory exercise. Cardiorespiratory is more accurate than cardiovascular because it isn't looking at my vascular health. It's looking at my body's ability to consume oxygen. And the number here is represented in milliliters of oxygen that each kilogram of my body could consume in a minute if I was going full hard. And these numbers often confuse people because they think there might be a percentage. But if I want someone's VO2 max, let's imagine you and I now, I'd like it to be at least 40 milliliters per kilogram per minute, because that's probably enough for me to do most of the things I want to do in my life. But also VO2 max, a bit like other forms of physiology, depreciates with age. So from something like 35 onwards, I'll lose 10% per decade, and then I'll lose 15% from 50. And what is funny, Harry, is lots of people confuse loss of fitness with aging. Right? So the person who can't get out of the house has lost VO2 max and muscle mass. They're not older. They've lost two biological systems that have depreciated as they would with age, unless they are attenuated with the one thing that would stop them drifting, which is exercise. And this is why you're seeing VO2 max linked back now to this new word longevity, which is the new vehicle for well-being globally. So longevity, this idea of not living longer, but having less years ill. So females in the UK have got a life expectancy of 83, but a health span of 64. Right? So your average female in the UK is going to be ill for 19 years at the end of their life. What you're seeing now is everyone's excited about how do I influence behavior to narrow that so that I die well, as awkward a sort of conversation as that is. But principally, that health span, so how many years am I healthy, should be as close to lifespan as possible. And VO2 max and the retention of muscle mass, so my reason for weight training and my reason for doing endurance exercise, is now become the fundamental principle of who is winning in the longevity battle. So VO2 max has become a longevity parameter. It's become a parameter for who should go into who should survive an operation and we shouldn't operate on, who should operate on. And what we've got is lots of technology saying, well, the test of putting a mask on and cycling to exhaustion is horrendous. So they do 1,000 people doing that test, and then they measure those same people with their heart rate variability, their resting heart rate, their movement levels, their heart rate at certain walking speeds. And they go, actually, we can work it out roughly without you ever doing the lab test. So your Whoop is going to work out VO2 max without you doing the lab test. And when I talk about minimum effective dose, my running, which is mostly for my mental health and psychological well-being, but I do my minimum amount of cardiovascular exercise so my VO2 max doesn't drop. And every year, I have to work harder to stop it dropping. So, that's sort of where data plays in. So VO2 max is an unbelievably critical parameter that's moving out of the sports performance labs into the clinics, into the mainstream, and it just needs a rebrand.
So that's fascinating. I wish we did a whole podcast episode just on VO2 max. Like, I'm being serious. I really so the easiest way for somebody to get that score and to maintain is a wearable, or is are there other ways to do that?
People probably remember doing the bleep test at school. So bleep test was a maximum test that we said, people who got to level, which is the intermittent sprint test. So you run between two fixed points, it's like 20 or 22 meters, and then the beeps get faster and faster. And the further you go, people who got to like level 10 had a VO2 max of 44. People who got to level 8 had a VO2 max of 37. So you could do what's called a field test, of which the most popularized is something called the Cooper's 12-minute test, which is just how far you can run in 12 minutes. So you do it on a treadmill, and then you put that into an online algorithm, bang. I work with a company called Hero, and they, at the moment, and whether it's true at the time of this going out, have an app, which I can put a link in your footnotes, where you can do a 2 minutes high knees test at home. And it basically, your camera on your phone will calculate your depreciation of your power over the 2 minutes and create an accurate VO2 max that you can do at home and track at home. Because I want people to be able to do this, right? And we are. I've worked with lots of different technology companies, but I want everybody to know their VO2 max, Harry. I just think it's the best incentive to do cardio and the best ratchet to work out whether the cardio is proving effective or not. Because lots of people train 2 in the grey, so lots of people just go out and run at the same speed, what we might call zones 3 or zone 3-4, rather than lean into what we call polarized training. And there's no universal right on this, but we often find people need to spend more time with a low intensity cardiovascular exercise, what is often called zone 2 or zone 1 even, and some time in zones 4 and 5, rather than all their time in zone 3. And from a physiological adaptation point of view, we want that low and high rather than that grey middle.
Is that HIIT training?
Good question.
Or is it a bit more than that?
HIIT would form a part of the zone 4-5. So that's that pockets of high intensity interval training. So Tabata would be shorter bursts of that, or 1 minute on, 2 minutes off. So that HIIT training would be the high intensity work. When I'm talking about zone 1 and 2, it's that gentle bike ride where my heart rate is just at maybe 60% of its maximum. So if we take...
There's still exercise involved versus that kind of complete nothingness.
Exactly. Right. And it may be just more than a walk, right? So zone 2 for someone who's a little more frail or fragile could very much be a walk. But for you and I, taking an assumption on where we're at, it would need to probably be a light run or a deliberate cycle or a hill climb.
Okay.
And so thinking of, if I take a 40-year-old individual, we're working on the idea their maximum heart rate is 220 minus their age. Now, there's flaws to that, but for the purpose, again, it won't be a million miles away for your average individual. So that 40-year-old's got a maximum heart rate of 180. Their zone 2 would be somewhere around 60% of that. So 60% of 180. So they'll be into the what's that going to be, 125, a bit higher, 128. It's not hard, but it's not easy. I feel somewhat hard is sort of the principle.
Amazing. And I feel like the conversation has steered from your early days to now almost talking about the future and what's to come and what people are now doing more. What do you see your world looking like in 2030 in terms of these conversations? I guess we're starting to see these trends already. People want this information and it's becoming more accessible, it feels like. What are you excited about? What are you perhaps fearful about? And of course, AI, we haven't spoken about just yet. Yeah,
I think AI can be a great aid in my space because it's more data means more accumulation of data. There's bias, right? So if you go and see... If you see me and I've seen 10 people who've all got the dysregulated autonomic nervous system, which is manifesting as slightly low testosterone. The 11th person, I'll think that's the same model as well. So that's just clinician bias. AI won't have that. So let's imagine AI is going to become my data tranche. And I go, what are the patterns within this data? Because for all of our joys about data, it's still siloed. It's just a different silo. So your wearable data is siloed from your lab work, which is siloed from your imaging work, which is siloed from your therapy conversation, right? So what we're seeing increasingly, and the movement's already happening. Whoop Labs is opening, Aura Labs is opening. We have companies like Stride One running, direct consumer lab testing, Health Zone. We're seeing companies that are launching these sort of at-home blood diagnostic kits, and they are rolling that data into your wearable, and they're starting to go, right, now I'm seeing the pattern between the number of steps you take, the quality of that has on your sleep, and the impact of your sleep on your inflammatory marker C-reactive protein. Mm-hmm. And so as we sort of further democratize these tests, you'll be able to go, my bathroom cabinet will go, Oli, you need to go for a walk today. Otherwise, your disease risk will go up by 0.2%. And some will lean into that, some will lean away from it. Where do I sit in that? I don't know. I'm waiting to be replaced. I've been waiting to be replaced for a long time, both in my marriage and in my professional life. I sort of sit there. Every time the technology moves on, there seems to be another human gap that pops up. And right. To me, there is something eminently human about humans, and the sense that even if you got the best strategy in the world, and if you ran all your labs now, and labs is sort of a very Americanized way of saying blood work, so if you had your bloods, Harry, and you had your wearable, and you had your recent health assessment, and you put all that into ChatGPT in its current format and said, what should I do? It will tell you probably one or two things that are absolutely spot on, but you still might want to sit with me and go, but what should I really do? And there's a human piece to this, which is just we don't quite believe it to be true until we sort of see it reflected back in either a practitioner or someone we trust. So, but I think we will see the aggregation happening. And I think some of those wearables will start to look a bit more like the labs. So we've got continuous glucose monitoring. Can we have continuous hormonal monitoring that lots of companies are trying to crack, that we get these circadian hormones, so cortisol and melatonin, which would really reflect my wake and sleep cycle, measured continuously. Can we get, I've got working with a company called Camlian, we've got a urinal that's going to measure your hydration status and give you accurate feedback on how much, fluids you need and whether you need electrolytes or not. I think we're going to find this sort of data collection ecosystem building and becoming more intuitive. But where I am and sitting in the middle of that, and whether it really asked me whether I'm happy or whether I'm fulfilled or whether I'm, living a life that's true to me, and how that data collects to that, I think it will still need a human component. Yeah. But I don't think, I think the diagnosticians are going to be most in trouble. So if we're trying to make and again, I love GPs, and I've spoken about this before, but a GP will be taking that, that symptom history, some basic testing, and saying, oh, that is a virus, or that's a bacteria, or that needs a referral to an ear, nose, and throat. That piece will become very aided by AI. And that well-known phrase, which is, AI isn't going to replace people, but people who use AI will replace people who don't. And I think who, absorbs this advanced diagnostic ability to assimilate hundreds of thousands of data points, but then communicate that with real meaning and empathy, that person will do very well. And I hope I'll be in around supporting the training and creation of those individuals, and helping individuals navigate their pathway into what is judicious and what might be fictitious.
Yeah, I completely hear you on the point around actually what comes with the next wave tends to be another human need. And I can see, and I've probably learned more in this, selfishly in this hour than I have done around my own well-being, just reflecting and hearing you kind of, I guess, bring what are quite complicated concepts into my everyday. And I'm already thinking now, okay, well, how do I get my VO2 max? That's where I'm going. And I felt like I already would think that coming out of this anyway, because I had obviously researched. But I am really intrigued to see how the human exists alongside this massive interconnected knowledge we're going to have around our health. It feels like the blend could be incredibly powerful. And I like this idea of being able to look in the mirror and you automatically know what you're going to need next, or and you can see how easy that is going to become with what we now have available to us. From going on wearing it on your ring or your wristband to actually you're going to get probably a voice telling you before you start your day and ending your day that this is how you've done today and this is what you should probably think about tomorrow, feels for me like a really good place. But I know a lot of people would feel incredibly anxious by the fact that that's happening.
They would. Well, they need to trust the integrity of the source, and everyone, knowing that the big companies who'll do this may not be as interested in your health as they are in you subscribing. And I think that's very difficult when you try and find a truly pure commercial model that sets you free at the right moment, because no one wins from setting you free. No one really gets commercial recompense when you come off a drug, come off a supplement, come off a training program. So, the danger is holding people ever more beholden to something else rather than being free to manage themselves. And I think that's a really tricky play. How do we give people true autonomy through data rather than create them beholden to the data? And the beauty of this, you don't get healthier from testing. You get healthier from the thing you do with that information. And so this isn't going to bring you a friend over to go for a lunchtime walk. This isn't going to prep you a great quality meal. There's going to the behavior piece, the James Clear and the habit formation, that will sit at the heart of it. So those who create a frictionless ability for me to adhere to these habits more effectively, they are going to be the winners. Like I said, biophilic design had a fantastic guy on my podcast, which is, what is this plant doing for us? What is the air quality in here doing this? How do we bring sort of all of these things to a more passive environment that make it easier for me to take choices that I now know from a data point of view will be impactful, but I'm still going to make those choices.
Well, I want to speak for hours, but we have a set of recurring questions that I'm going to have to ask. And we've touched on some of them, to be fair.
Yeah. But
what's one societal rule you'd erase or completely rewrite if you could?
That old people are worthless. I think, again, when we look at blue zones and other things, I think just the way we push old people out of society and the lack of integration, which you see in pockets, and we know it works between schools and care homes and hospices and youth. I just think a societal rule that you have a depreciating value as you age. I think this current generation have been screwed by the pace of change. So the digital revolution has really made these generations are much narrower now. And between someone who's a boomer and a Gen Alpha, that what are they going to talk about? But in the middle of that is humanity. And I think that somehow finding a greater reverence for the aged would be a societal rule that I'd like overhauled.
I was hooked by the blue zones.
You're hooked
when I read about it. I read about it and tried to find that place that was realistic. And I honestly have tried to move to what I felt was the blue zone. How can I get enough of that environment into my life? Do you agree with the principles around it? Do you think we should have more access to those blue zone principles into our school system, into our workplaces? I
do. I think, the piece, again, the debate around localized diet and seasonality, and there's debate on the data analytics as well of the blue zone.
There's a few things in there.
There's lots going on, but I think the principles, I don't care whether someone's living to be 100 or not. These are areas without a doubt where there is an abundance of virility and vivacity in aging. So whether it's statistically everything people have made it out to be, the principles are great. And the principle that sticks out to me more than any other is that tribal component, which is, moving as a definable community and a role for elders in those tribes.
100%.
And that piece, before I get into fiber and seasonal and oily fish, that piece sticks to me as the defining trait, which is you are an increasingly valuable asset as you age.
Yeah.
And we need to somehow find a way of bringing individuals in their later years into society in more dynamic ways.
Yeah. That's such a good point, because we, in our society, yes, we can get the types of nuts that it talks about and the thing of the particular wine at a particular moment.
Exactly.
But the thing that we've lost massively in this society is that ability to connect on a human-to-human level.
Agreed.
And across the generations
Agreed.
as well. I'm so glad I asked that question. Great answer too. What's one belief, I guess, you used to hold about your mental health or your wider physical health that you've since let go of?
It's a good question, this. I don't think I've changed massively. I probably believed more in the power of behavior to change state than I do now. I was that sense when you're dealing with real clinical depression, you're saying, look, if you exercise in nature and you go to sleep on time and you eat a diverse, nutrient-rich diet and you sort of get to a point where I think you could fix it through physiology. I think that belief was challenged enormously by people who micromanaged all of those behaviors, but were still psychologically not where they wanted to be. And actually, from an illness point of view, weren't where they wanted to be. And that in clinical practice is difficult. So if I measure 10,000 data points on you and you're unbelievably well on paper, Harry, but you are presenting as unwell, then there's a whole system of biology I haven't measured, or you're more complicated than medical science would understand. And what we know in 20 years' time will be different to what we know now. But I think my belief would be that there is a greater sense to well-being than the mechanics of what we currently understand, whether that's, energy, whether that is, a higher purpose, faith, whether that is our soul. And I look at where people are not probably in that purpose domain, fulfilling some sense of a reason for being. And you can draw that to good solid psychology. But for me, when people were absent from purpose, illness would still find a way despite behavior. And as a physiologist, that's tough. Now, what that doesn't mean is I don't go to alternative forms of energy management or go at purpose before I get you sleeping, nourishing, moving. But I think I was humbled to realize I didn't hold all the tools to make everyone well all the time. And I learned that early in that clinic, and then reached out to other people who can connect on a deeper spiritual level or go through modalities that aren't traditionally medically authorized. But I saw some incredible results from body talk, from psychedelics, from ayahuasca, where you go, I can't explain what's just happened there. But because I can't explain it physiologically doesn't mean it's not true. It just means we don't know how to explain it yet. So a humility that behavior is the foundation, but it won't be the entire roadmap.
Yeah. I really like that. And you mentioned kind of briefly within that around purpose. And I kind of worry a bit that we rely on our work for purpose too much as a society. But at the same time, we're seeing such significant change in the workplace.
Yes.
From a people number perspective.
Yes.
That actually naturally now we are going to have smaller workforces within the vast majority of businesses, yet a significant millions of people who depended on that purpose, and that has been normalized purpose for decades of their life, with a skill set now that is no longer needed in a working environment.
Agreed.
And I worry there around suicide, if I'm honest. If I'm very, very honest, that's almost the byproduct of what could happen if we don't find ways of bringing purpose, I think, into those that are displaced.
I think that's very fair.
And I'm intrigued because everything that kind of thinking back to the blue zones now, and everything that you've shared is I think we need to do more to look after the basic health of those who are being made redundant. Agreed. But also how do we then support those to find meaning and purpose if the jobs are not there?
Agreed. And you need to, so much to that. And that will be a huge part of what you are doing. And it's instilling a sense of worth beyond my role. You see this in retirement, right? If I'm a lawyer and I go to a dinner party 2 months after, I go, what do you do? I'm a retired lawyer. What are you? What are you now? And are you a lawyer? Are you a doctor? Are you a podcaster? Of course, we need to have roles that we can attach our value to, but am I not more than those things? And how do I find value in being a father? How do I in being a volunteer? I love seeing people at Park Run, which I think is one of the greatest
100%,
social enterprises, volunteering. And you're like, I know that those people volunteering will receive a significant physiological, psychophysiological benefit over the coming week because they contributed to something that contributed to the lives of others. And so I don't need to turn up at a dinner party with a fancy job title, or I need to find a way in which I feel the essence of me was expressed and the essence of me was in some way contributive. But that must be above and beyond the role that I fulfill in work. As you say, as those roles depreciate year on year, if I'm only defined by my worth in my job title, then I'm fragile.
I was very lucky to go to Atlanta last year. There's a TED talk just on exactly that around I can't remember the guy's name now, it's really frustrating me, around how we should tactically in our week find places where we don't need to explain our identity about work.
Yes.
And his name is at the tip of my tongue, but it was almost like groundbreaking. Like how obvious this is that we have created these identities that are purely work identities, but actually there's a million and one things that make us who we are, and actually we have this tendency to do that. So absolutely spot on. And is there something you've, I guess, never shared or rarely said publicly, but perhaps feel ready to now, whether on this topic or something connected?
I don't have a big thing in my closet that I could unveil. I suppose I have a very fortunate life. I put parts of my life out there on social media. My father is unwell. He has a form of Parkinsonism called multiple system atrophy, which is a bit like a motor neuron disease. So it's a depreciating neurological condition. So he's homebound and stuck there. And I suppose there's a sense of everybody's got something. And what I don't often share is that that's a very challenging situation for my parents, who are an extraordinary couple, and they lean into that with nothing but gratitude and joy, and that is driven by their faith, which is the lightning rod for their life. But they, there is, in everybody's life there is some form of trauma, and no one will get to middle ages without losing people or without finding things. And I think the framing of those things is so visibly clear to me on a regular basis that here is really a very challenging situation. And, if I go to that house, it's nothing but laughter and joy. And that is about, how they've chosen to create their relationship with it, which affects all of our relationships with it. So I don't talk about it. I don't show my dad on any of my posts, etc. He's, he was a huge and part of my life and a wonderful man. But we all have a thing going on, but how you react to that thing is how much that thing will affect you, and so it warrants its own deeper discussion. But
Thank
you put the question. I've never spoken about it before, so
thank you for sharing that. And wish you all the kind of best and kind of love to your family as well. And it kind of, as you're talking then around almost a choice and how that connects your family around how your parents have kind of absorbed and made sense of that.
Yes.
The sad recent news around Lewis Moody and his motor neuron disease. That's where my head went straight away, was to seeing how Lewis and his wife Annie responded to that moment, and how that's now automatically created this laughter and hope and joy, and we are going to make the most of this horrendous situation.
Agreed.
And it's quite hard to make sense of those moments, I think, from the outside. But
it is.
It's kind of huge testimony, I guess, to your family and the role that they've kind of played to you and how you've explained that. So all the kind of best and love to your family there. But
thank you, Harry.
And I guess on a final kind of note here, we always ask our guests to talk about 2035 as a year, 10 years from now, and perhaps what you worry we might be talking about, or perhaps what you hope we will be talking about.
Yeah, I think in 2035, at a societal level, I'm just keen that I'm still in close proximity to my wife, my kids, and that I've sustained those relationships at a level that's followed the trajectory I'm on. So that would be the personal piece. I think from a society point of view, I years ago we had David Cameron, who polarized opinion with the Brexit vote and lost out. But before Brexit, there was big society, and it was the first political thing that I really connected with. This idea again, we all play a bit of a role. If you pick up a bit of litter on the street, it plays a role. If you take your tray back up in a restaurant, it plays a role. If you again don't drive like a maniac round a roundabout, it plays a role. And I just hope something above and beyond tragedy unites us to move more cohesively as a society. And I think where we've seen polarization of opinion through social media, I don't know what that would be to bring us back to a state of much greater kindness. What I would like is a kinder society to the values and opinions of others, but also to the care and love of oneself. And I think kindness is such a disappointing word for me, which represents the very essence of what I'm drawn to from others, what I try to deliver in myself, and what will make me sob. I cry every TV program at home, but it's the same thing when a stranger is kind to someone else, or someone is selfless. If someone gives up their life for someone else, that's me gone. I don't care what we're watching. If it's a cartoon, I'll cry. And the kids are physically sick of this. But I think somehow what I would like for society is a reconnection of where that can be, I suppose, enabled, and there may need to be certain mechanisms that are disabled for that to happen. But I would very much like to see a change in social media that allows kindness, removes polarization, yet doesn't take away the voice of everyone to speak their mind. So I don't know what that looks like, but that's what I would like.
I absolutely love that. And there's a book just for that. What's in a nutshell?
So good.
It is very, very accurate to that, how we build kindness into our everyday society. And the things have to change as part of that. But that's a very fitting note, I think. I am wildly over time, which is which is brilliant. But absolute pleasure. I really, really enjoyed that conversation. There's a million things I wish we got to. I'm sure we'll maybe have a chance another time. But thank you so much.
It was my pleasure, Harry. Great questions and again, a great movement. And I hope some of these things are truly useful. But I hugely appreciate you having me on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. There was so much value to be taken from that episode. I think the conversation will really stick with me for a long, long time. Oli has this brilliant way of cutting through the noise, reminding us that being well isn't about tracking every single number or chasing the latest trend, but actually it's about listening to what our bodies are trying to tell us. I think a few ideas that will stay with me, this concept of perhaps in society we have medicalized symptoms that are often just signals. Tiredness, low mood, poor sleep, all pointing to lives that are overstretched and under-recovered. He has an amazing line about most people being inadequately recovered. I think it sums it up perfectly. We're surrounded by noise, stimulus and stress, and we mistake the absence of illness for the presence of health. And it's just not the case. And I loved his honesty about recovery, not just being about ice baths and gadgets, but actually it's about stillness, connection and joy. Things that restore us rather than just distract us. What I love about Oli is that he talks about well-being as not being another job, but actually it's a foundation that lets everything else work. It's not about more data, more supplements or more routines. It's about asking clearer, direct and simpler questions. Do I feel the way I think I should feel? Am I giving myself enough time to recover? Thank you so much for listening today. And if this episode made you pause and think about what being well actually means for you, please do consider sharing it with someone whom you think might need it too. Your support, as always, on this podcast means a huge, huge amount. Thank you.